Hey y'all, and welcome to another video in my service dog series. Today's video we're going to be focusing on one of the major laws that talks about service animals. Today's video is about the Fair Housing Act, or the FHA. Now, the Fair Housing Act is under the jurisdiction of the Housing and Urban Development Department. Like my ADA video, I have a handy-dandy printout in front of me, and I think it's really important that I just read the first couple paragraphs, because the way that they explain this, while using some fancier than necessary verbiage, it really succinctly summarizes everything. The Fair Housing Act, or FHA, makes it unlawful for a housing provider to refuse to make a reasonable accommodation that a person with a disability may need in order to have equal opportunity to enjoy and use a dwelling. One common request housing providers receive is for a reasonable accommodation to providers pets or no animal policies, so that individuals with disabilities are permitted to use assistance animals in housing, including public and common use areas. Assistance animals are not pets. They are animals that do work, perform tasks, assist, and or provide therapeutic emotional support for individuals with disabilities. There are two types of assistance animals. 1. Service animals. And 2. Other animals that do work, perform tasks, provide assistance, and or provide therapeutic emotional support for individuals with disabilities, referred to in this guidance as a, quote, support animal. An animal that does not qualify as a service animal or other type of assistance animal is a pet for the purposes of the FHA and may be treated as a pet for the purpose of the lease and the housing provider's rules and policy. A housing provider may exclude or charge a fee or deposit for pets in its discretion and subject to local law, but not for service animals or other assistance animals. So let's break that down a little bit, because in that, it gave us a very basic overview of what animals are protected. It also pointed out a couple things. So the FHA protects service animals, obviously. It also protects other animals that do work, perform tasks, provide assistance, and or provide therapeutic emotional support for individuals with disabilities. So what this looks like is basically their fancy way of saying emotional support animals. Depending on how much training has been involved up to that point, one can also consider making argument there for service dogs who are still in training. Because service animals that haven't been fully trained yet are not technically service animals. And that was a point that the ADA made, that service animals in training are not covered by the ADA, but service animals are. So it depends on how you define your service animal in training. For people with psychiatric service dogs in training, they probably also provide emotional or therapeutic emotional support. So you have that workaround there. Here's a couple of the things that those first two paragraphs really stated. It's unlawful for a housing provider to refuse to make a reasonable accommodation that a person living with a disability may need in order to have equal opportunity to enjoy and use a dwelling. So that means that the landlord needs to make every opportunity they can, within reason, to give someone with a disability an equal opportunity to enjoy living and actually be able to live in an apartment. They say dwelling because that would define either a townhome for rent or a condo or an apartment. I may use the word apartment just because that's applicable for where I have lived previously, but bear with me. It also clearly states assistant animals aren't pets. That's a big one. That's a win. Given how some former laws have been a little wishy-washy, it's nice to have that in black and white. They also are not subject to pet fees or deposits. And that's something that they state very clearly. So they talk about a lot of information on what's reasonable, what's not, and this document here is actually their guidance on how to help landlords determine if they should be considering that accommodation for the animal to live in the dwelling. They do have the ADA definition of a service animal right here at the top of page 6. And basically they have a little flowchart of sorts, how to work through if they should allow it, and how to determine if it's a service animal that meets ADA definition. So 1, is the animal a dog? If no, the animal is not a service animal, but may be another type of assistance animal for which a reasonable accommodation is needed. And then it says skip to part 2. Question 2 is it readily apparent that the dog is trained to do work or perform tasks for the benefit of an individual with a disability? If yes, it says further inquiries are unnecessary and inappropriate. So if the dog is pulling someone in a wheelchair, or a guide dog, for instance, where it's really clear that the person is being guided by the dog, or obvious things, often what's known as visible disabilities, then it's kind of moot to ask more questions. If it's, the other example they give here is providing assistance with stability or balance. If you can see that the animal is actively working, then it's a service animal. The next question, the housing provider may ask if the animal is required because of a disability and what work or task the animal has been trained to perform. We've heard those before. Those were in the ADA. Those are what businesses are also allowed to ask. The 2 magic questions. It also says here in black and white, do not ask about the nature or extent of the person's disability, and do not ask for any documentation. A housing provider, at its discretion, may make the truth and accuracy of information provided during the process part of the representations made by the tenant. Anywho. If the animal does not provide tasks, or was said to not be a service animal, it does not qualify as a service animal, but may be a support animal. So you go to the next question, and next section of this, talking about reasonable accommodations for other animals. Basically, it's asking about a lot of questions like, has the individual, requested a reasonable accommodation that is asked to keep or get an animal in connection with a physical or mental impairment or disability. If not, the housing provider doesn't have to do anything. Sometimes having everything in writing is really important. Does the person have an observable disability, or does the housing provider already have information giving them reason to believe the person has a disability? If yes, then you don't have to try and figure out if they have a disability. If no, you get to learn about the differences in observable and non-observable disabilities, which is their way of saying visible and invisible disabilities. Basically, you have to request intent to get an animal or have an animal on the property, request accommodations. They also explain that it is not the housing provider's responsibility to determine if the person has a disability or not. They're not doctors. That's not their job. Let me see the exact wording here. While housing providers will be unable to observe or identify some of these impairments, individuals with disabilities sometimes voluntarily provide more detail about their disabilities than the housing provider actually needs to make decisions on accommodation requests. When this information is provided, housing providers should request it. That's basically saying they're not supposed to ask, but if you volunteer it, they can use it. Information about a disability may include determination of disability from a federal, state, or local government agency, receipt of disability benefits or services like SSDI or SSI, eligibility for housing assistance or a housing voucher received because of a disability, or information coming from a healthcare professional confirming a disability. So that's basically a doctor's letter. The way it used to work is you'd get a letter from your care team, whoever that may be, whether that's your therapist, your doctor, your neurologist, whomever, and it says, "Hi, I'm this person, here is my license number. I am familiar with the care of my patient," your name, "because of their disability, I feel that a service animal or emotional support animal or whatever, fill in the blank as needed, would benefit their treatment plan." Basically getting the doctor to acknowledge, I know this patient, they are disabled, they would benefit from an animal. They don't have to say, they would specifically benefit from this dog who has been trained to do X, Y, Z, because they're not trainers either. They don't know what dogs can do. They're not signing off that your dog is this perfect little angel that can do 50 million tasks. That's not their job. Their job is to assess their patient and their disabilities and what their needs may be. So there are a lot of other pieces of information in here, like unique support animals, like capuchin monkeys, are included in here, because of the differences between a service dog and a service capuchin, if you will. Fair Housing Act may grant that request, because the animal is trained to do tasks and help out their person, even though it's not a dog. Other things like that. If a reasonable accommodation request is denied because it would impose a fundamental alteration to the nature of the provider's operation or impose undue financial and administrative burden, the housing provider should engage in an interactive process to discuss whether alternative accommodation may be effective in meeting their needs. So that part's also important, because we're talking about reasonable accommodations. Sometimes some accommodations are unreasonable. That's how the world works. You can't go and rent an apartment and say, "Hey, I need you to tear this entire building down and rebuild it to these specifications." That's unreasonable. The big thing here is that it says an interactive process. So that means a discussion. That means the housing provider and the individual, or the individual's representative, discussing what would work if they can't have their previous accommodation request approved. When it comes to service animals, sometimes they're denied, usually because of undue financial burden. And that usually comes in the form of their insurance, the housing provider's insurance costs increasing exponentially. That is possible. You would be able to get that in writing, and that would be how you would discuss that. There are more pages on all this information, but the biggest thing is that there is a step-by-step process of what housing providers can and cannot ask. They, assuming that they recognize the animal as a service animal, using the same definitions that we already talked about with the ADA, you cannot be expected to pay fees or deposits for that animal in your apartment. If you have a service animal and a pet, you still have to pay a pet deposit and pet fee for the non-service animal. If you have multiple service animals, assuming it's a reasonable request, again, we're talking reasonable accommodations, it has to be reasonable, right? You can't be expected to pay for both, assuming that accommodation gets approved. A really good example there would be my service dog and my husband having an emotional support animal. Neither of us would be paying, even though a lot of places have a 2-pet limit. Neither of these animals are pets. That's one of the first things it says. Assistance animals are not pets. So neither of them would count towards that 2-pet limit. So we could have 2 pets and then our other 2 animals because they're assistance animals. I know that was a lot of rambling and a lot of words. The Fair Housing Act can be kind of tricky. That's why it's very important to read all the information you can, preferably before you start your apartment search. But yeah, if you have any questions, drop them below and I will do my absolute best to answer them when I can. Stay tuned for more videos in my service dog series, and I hope you have a wonderful day.